That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Is that okay?
Once does the
Want to sit in the middle?
shift over.
On the
Maybe we can get a,
Once she starts.
Oh, we can sit that way.
Oh, you want to? Am I not blocking? 'Cause I thought maybe I should be
Okay,
more that
you
way.
can,
yeah,
yeah.
we can move.
Yeah. Well, I think you want to start first.
What's that?
Start all the
We'll
movement.
start in 1 minute. There are 2 more seats here if you don't mind sitting too close to me. I promise not to bite, so it's all. And Ishmael, if everybody's in, we go ahead and get started? Is that good? Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to this session on electoral commissions and the consolidation of democracy in Africa. What we want to do today is we have a really good panel here, so I don't want to take too much of their time. Just really get into the discussion. Many of you, I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I know that many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center, so I won't give you the whole mission statement of the Wilson Center, except to say part of our mission is to focus on key issues and challenges that affect the world and issues that affect the United States. As the Africa program, we focus on key issues that impact Africa, and we try to bring together practitioners and scholars to discuss these key issues, and more importantly, to offer some options and recommendations on how those key issues and challenges might be addressed. So today we're focusing on a key issue on the African continent, which is democratic governance in Africa. And I'll say right from the outset that quite a few people took exception with me on the title for this event. I think a couple of people wrote in and said there is no democracy to consolidate in Africa. Well, I beg to differ. The African governance landscape of 2014 is very different from the African landscape in 1990. We do have to acknowledge that progress. I think having said that, we all know that even though Africa has been on this upward trajectory with democratic governance, the qualitative democracy still needs to be improved. And from my perspective, democracy is a process, it's not an event, and so I think we need to put it in that larger context. And that's what I hope we're going to be doing here today. I will also say that it is important to remember that elections do not a democracy make by themselves. And I wanted to state that up front in case some of you feel we are equating elections with democracy, which we are not. But it is important to acknowledge that elections are a key part, a critical part of democratic governance. And we want to focus on this very narrow yet important slice of the democratic equation, that is elections and the management of elections in Africa. Those of you who are keen followers of elections in Africa understand that election time can be one of the most tense period in a country. It can also be a time when conflict is threatened in many countries, in part because of the really high stakes that characterize African elections. And so the management of elections becomes an even more important within that context, especially where societies are fragile, the national identity is fragile, constitutions are fragile. How elections are managed become extremely critical. And I think we recently had examples of that. We had 2 major transitions occur in Africa over the last couple of weeks. The president of, the president of Burkina Faso resigned. And I think the instability that we saw there spoke volumes about the lack of governance institutions to manage that transition. And so this is important. On the other hand, we saw the president of Zambia die. And very quickly it was announced that, elections, per the constitutions, elections would be held in 90 days. And I remember calling our speaker when President Sata died and asked, are you still coming, understanding the responsibilities that she had in Zambia? And her response was basically, why wouldn't I? I'm on my way. But it also told me that Zambian people had confidence in the process, in the electoral management bodies, that they could release their director of the Electoral Commission to come out here and observe our elections. So those are just 2 examples that I thought I would highlight. But this discussion is even more important because we have 19 African countries coming up for elections in 2015. And those of you who are followers of that schedule understand that in some of these countries, those elections are absolutely critical. Not only do they have national implications, but they also have regional implications. And here I think of countries such as Nigeria. As Nigeria goes, so does West Africa go, and in some ways, so does Africa go. And so it's really important how those elections are managed. So I could think of no better panel to help us address these issues than the 3 people that we have with us here today. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker is going to be Ms. Priscilla Mlenga Isaac, who's been a dear friend for over 30 years. I know that dates me and explains my gray hairs, while she has none. And I'm really pleased that she was able to join us today. She is the director of the Electoral Commission of Zambia, and she joined the Electoral Commission of Zambia in 2000 as a public relations officer and gradually rose to the position of director of the Elections Commission in 2011. She has vast experience in election management. She has observed many elections in the Southern African Development Community, the SADC region, and beyond. And she holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and public administration, as well as a degree in law from the University of Zambia. And she's currently pursuing another master's degree in strategic planning. I'd be really curious to see if Priscilla would touch on her observation of our November 4 elections here, because I think that's an interesting perspective of someone else looking at how we manage our elections here as well. Our second speaker is going to be Ms. Gretchen Berkel, who currently serves as Regional Director for Africa at the International Republican Institute, where she's responsible for developing and managing programs in transitioning African countries. Previously, she served as a senior coordinator at the State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and was a legislative assistant on foreign affairs and defense appropriations to Senator Alan Specter. She holds a master's from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a BA from Pennsylvania State University. And I'm so glad she could make it because we've been talking over email for a few months now. And so we finally get to meet. So thank you for coming, Gretchen. And then our third and final speaker is Dr. Keith Jennings. He is a Senior Associate and Regional Director for Southern and East Africa at the National Democratic Institute. And over the past 15 years, he has represented NDI in 30 countries, working on a range of governance, civil society, political party, and elections programs. Prior to joining NDI, Dr. Jennings worked with the World Council of Churches, the NAACP, and Amnesty International. He has also been a consultant with the United Nations Development Program and the Children's Defense Fund. He holds a PhD from Clark Atlanta University and a BA from Fisk University. And I think what's really good, one of the things that's really good about this panel is that we get on-the-ground experience in Africa, but also perspectives from international actors who have worked for a long time with African countries on these issues. And so with that, Priscilla, I'll turn the mic over to you, and you have 15 minutes. Shall we go?
Okay.
All right.
Okay, but maybe I'll move to the further
Sure.
so that at least I leave, my back is not blocking the screen.
And before you get started, I'm also glad, Wupe, where are you? A young African Democrat in training. Wupe is Priscilla's son, whom I babysat many, many years ago.
Okay. Thanks very much, Monde, and good afternoon to you all. I'll just say simply, protocols observed. I must say it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. When Monde first asked me to share the Zambian experience, I wasn't expecting a full room. I was just thinking like it might be about 10 people from her department, but thanks so much for taking the time. I will go within my 15 minutes. That's just a brief outline, and I'm sure you'll be given copies of my presentation. I'll just give like a brief background as to what the Electoral Commission is all about and to go on to our achievements and challenges, because I think that's what the focus should be for this afternoon. That's to give you an idea for those of you who may not be too familiar with Zambia, where we are. We're in Africa, more or less in the south there. We are landlocked. We have a population of about 13 million. We have 10 provinces, yeah. And our country size is quite large, not as big as the US, but it's about 752,000 square. Our president is directly elected, appoints cabinet from members of parliament, serves a term of 5 years. The same goes for our MPs. We have 150 constituencies, 1 MP each. They're all directly elected, and the same applies to local government. We have 1,422 local councils. We conduct our elections under the first-past-the-post system. And we were established as a commission in 1996, and those are the main elections that we have covered since 1996. 1996, 1998, 2001, that's when we got brave and ventured into conducting 3 elections on one day, and we've been doing that ever since. So our general elections are also known as tripartite: presidential, parliamentary, and local government. The last election we conducted was in 2011, and unfortunately in 2008 we lost our president and we had to conduct a presidential by-election, and sadly we have to do another one in January. We were established in 1996 as an autonomous body under the Constitution, so we are completely independent. We don't fall under any government department or ministry. Our members serve full-time. Prior to that, we had 2 part-time commissions. Our chairperson and members are appointed by the president, but this is subject to ratification by parliament. So if the president presents some names to parliament that people are not happy with, then he has to go back, rethink, and think of who else he can appoint. So parliament has to give the go-ahead for the appointment of our commission. In terms of our functions, we've got both constitutional functions and statutory functions. The main functions are to conduct elections, do delimitation, and voter registration. Statutory is to supervise a referendum, local government elections, voter education, conflict management, and come up with regulations and anything else that Parliament may wish us to do. I've already talked about the composition. In terms of our operations and structure, I and all the other staff are appointed directly by the Commission. So we are not civil servants. We are public service workers, but not civil servants. We don't account to anybody else, and neither does the Commission. We are based in Lusaka. That's just an overview of our structure. We are not decentralized, unfortunately. We are all based in Lusaka, and we have the different departments to support our activities. Just to give you an idea of our boundaries, there's the national boundary, then we have 10 provinces. Within the 10 provinces, we have 103 districts, and within the 103 districts, we have 150 constituencies, 1,422 wards, and 6,456 polling stations. This just to give you an idea it's eating into my 15 minutes. Hurry up. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of our provinces and districts. The late president increased the number of districts from 74 to 103. We have 10 provinces, but this is an old map. It won't show you the new province. But anyway, you'll get to look at the full map on your site. So, allow me to proceed. Okay. So I did mention that we are not decentralized, but that gives you an idea of the structure that we use during elections. We use part-time officers, and these are mainly, the elections at local level will be superintended by the executive head of a district, of a city, or a town, and then these are just the field officers that you would be familiar with since you just had your elections. Let me move briefly to our achievements and challenges. I'm glad to say that our achievements outweigh our challenges, and I would say that in Zambia we've come a long way in consolidating ourselves an electoral commission and contributing to the democracy of our country. Like what Monde said, an EMB is really the backbone, the starting point, and so you really need to have a strong, solid commission in place. So basically, I can proudly say that we have an open and transparent electoral process. I've got some of my Zambian counterparts here. They can either back me or, anyway, say what they feel. I'm very open to that. We introduced a permanent biometric voters register. We transmit our election results electronically. Right now, we're in the process of developing software in-house to be able to transmit our election results electronically from the polling station. Right now, we do it from the constituency to head office. We have a human resource base of professional and competent elections and support staff, and that's why I'm able to be here today, because I know that the engine is still running even though I'm away from home. The phone doesn't stop ringing, emails don't stop coming through, but at least work is in progress for the election we're preparing for. We've established effective national and district political party liaison committees. This is what helps us with direct engagement with political parties, both at national and district level, even in between elections. We also have conflict management committees at national and district level that deal with electoral disputes. And in a way, this has helped reduce the number of disputes that get to the courts through petitions. We established the first voter education center in Africa. We're inspired by a visit to Australia, so if any of you come to Lusaka, we'll be very glad to take you to our voter education center. And we have established voter education clubs in schools. Right now, they're just at provincial level, but funds permitting, we hope to get down to district level so that we can outreach the kids at school. And like I said, look at the challenges. The main ones are the cost of elections, voter registration, centralization of the commission's operations, the powers of the commission. We wish we had a little bit more power to discipline political parties who breach our electoral laws, because that is a big challenge right now. Adherence to the code of conduct by political parties, media, traditional leaders, and stakeholder perception. Probably in the answer and question session, I'll be able to delve into more detail about that. I spoke about the achievements being our biometric voter registration, voter register that we have, and that's just to show you how we've progressed from field paper-based to a biometric voters register. That's the kit that we use for our voter registration. So it means that as soon as you register, you're issued with your voter's card. And that's to give you an idea of a rural voter registration center. The job still gets done with our kit in that structure. And there you can see some kids accompanied their parents, their mom and dad to the center. That's what our register looks like. It has the details of the voter. You can see the name and the sex and all. Those are our statistics from the last registration we did. We have 5.1 million on our register right now, and the females outdo the males by a slight percentage. We had a high turnout of first-time voters, as you can see, of 1.2 million in our last voter registration. This is just an overview of our elections process and results management. Okay. Thank you. So it's basically the same as the way you do it here, though we open slightly earlier than you do at 6 o'clock and in the morning, and we close at 6 in the evening. And I've already talked about the electronic transmission of results. And part of the transparency process, political parties and their agents are allowed to be present throughout the process, from the start to the finish, up to the time that results are declared and transmitted. Voter education, publicity and conflict management are one of the areas that we've made great strides in. And we have an open house policy with the public. And these are some of the strategies that we use. We're also looking out to the disabled voters, making provisions for sign language use, and also the jacket for those that are blind or have a challenge in terms of their sight. Gender issues, yeah, we have not managed to meet the 50% SADC threshold. We do not have an election quota law. So the challenges that most women complain about is that it's dependent on the political party's goodwill. It's very, very competitive. And one has to be a really strong candidate. Women complain of intimidation, harassment, inadequate or lack of resources, and just general support. 19 of the 147 MPs we have are women, only 19. Currently, we have 3 vacancies in Parliament because of issues that are still in court. And we only have 4 women who are full cabinet ministers, and out of the 28 deputy ministers, we only have 4 women. So you see, we're still there. People always ask about the cost of elections, and I spoke to you as it being one of the challenges. Elections are costly, but then there is the saying that democracy is expensive. And I'm proud to say that the Zambian government has been prepared to spend on elections. When I was listening to some of the amounts that are spent here, I was told that there was, in one state, like $100 million was spent between the Republican candidate and Democrat candidate. And for me, that would finance my election for 2016. So I wouldn't mind meeting them. That's just to give you an idea of what it cost. It cost us in 2011. And it's going to go up in 2016. I think for our presidential election, it's going to cost us about $300 million, close to $50 million. And what makes up the cost? We need to pay our staff, so that takes up quite a bit. But when I compare what the poll staff here are paid here, you actually pay your poll staff more than we do on a daily rate. Then, of course, there's equipment and materials that we have to buy. And since we are now high-tech, you know, technology costs money. And you have to keep on upgrading and enhancing. Also, the vastness of our country, the varying terrain also contributes to the cost. We have to use the Air Force in some cases, water transport in other cases. The voter needs to know about the elections, so the cost of publicity and voter education, you're all aware that publicity costs money. Capacity building of the police, the media, so that they do things right, also costs money in training them. And also the stakeholder engagement, because we do a lot of outreach with the youth and traditional leaders as well. And that's just our mission and vision and our values: transparency, impartiality, tolerance, openness, and teamwork. And our strategic direction going forward: enhancing the electoral process, strengthening the institutional and organizational capacity, and also the institutionalizing the independence of the ECZ. That's our building in Lusaka. That's where I sit Monday to Friday, and sometimes Saturday and Sunday. Just to show you where we're coming from and where we're at, those are our old voters' cards and the current one. The old one didn't have a photograph. This one has got photo. It's issued immediately. We used to use metal ballot boxes before. Now we use translucent ones, different colors for the different elections. And that's our old ballot paper. The current ballot paper has the photographs of the candidates now. And there's an urban polling station and a rural polling station. And where's the chopper? There we are. Yeah. We try to reach everybody. Okay? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Priscilla. I'll invite our two speakers back. And for those of you who are wondering, Zambia is just slightly bigger than Texas in terms of geographic size. So that's a size that we're talking about. And maybe in the Q&A, Priscilla can go into some of the changes that were made. Those metal boxes were always an issue, so it's good you can now see through the box and know if there's something already in there. All right, Gretchen, over to you.
Thank
That
you.
international perspective.
Thank you, Monde, and I'm delighted to join you and to be here with Dr. Isaac and our Director Isaac and my colleague Dr. Jennings and all of you today. And I wonder if we should keep the waving hand up there.
No, we'll turn the waving hand off.
So that was a very, very fascinating presentation. Thank you. And what I thought I would try to do today was to discuss many different outside and external influences on election commissions, and so that we can start to expand this into a broader perspective. And so this is looking at a variety of stakeholders and external factors. And so I'll review those first, and then I would like to give 3 examples from some different countries in Africa to discuss that. And so first, looking at external factors to the work of election commissions, I think it's important to look at how all of the stakeholders can influence the outcome of an election process. And what one generally sees is a need for consensus among political parties, civil society, and other stakeholders, and the election commission to institutionalize what are often very critical and necessary reforms to the process. And the importance of citizens' perceptions of this process and how to address this cannot be overestimated. So some examples of how external stakeholders contribute to the consolidation of necessary reforms in election administration process. I'll start by looking at political parties and how they may contribute to the debate. And that includes things such as arranging for political party polling agents to observe elections, dialogue and consensus building with election commissions well in advance of elections. And then political parties may also impact the process by perhaps agreeing to a political party code of conduct that has one of its mandates the adherence to the rules and procedures set forth by the Election Commission. And there are many, many good examples of that around the world, and the organization International IDEA has done that quite well around the world. I believe NDI has also done a lot of work on political party code of conducts. Those are very important roles in contributing to the election process. Civil society may contribute to the electoral process through work as domestic observers and advocacy efforts with election administration bodies, and I'll give some examples on that in a moment. And of course, international groups contribute to the electoral process through observation efforts and perhaps public opinion polling, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But then the process works in reverse also. When election commissions conduct, for example, voter education campaigns or public service announcements to ensure citizens understand their roles and responsibilities and how elections need to be conducted technically. And Director Isaac gave some very good examples of their voter education center in Zambia. And I would also commend you to look at the excellent website that the commission has in Zambia. It's very well done, it's very thorough, and it really offers a good opportunity for the citizens of Zambia to understand the process quite thoroughly. So those are all very important external inputs into the process and the role of election commissions and the overall general conduct of elections. So second, now I wanted to look at 3 case studies that demonstrate specifically how this process works. Starting with Nigeria and using examples of input from civil society, and then specifically a project on persons with disabilities, and finally how public opinion research can influence that process and the roles of commissions as well. Looking back briefly and historically, just to step aside for a moment, before we talk about the upcoming elections next year in 2015, we look at really three flawed elections in 1999, 2003, and 2007, before we look at the 2011 polls, the last elections they have, which are really critical for Nigeria's young democracy to take hold. Several important steps were taken in 2011 that set the stage for the forthcoming elections next year. And critical around those elections was a series of modifications made to the 2010 Electoral Act. Another key outcome of this process was to ensure that the Independent National Election Commission, INEC of Nigeria, had adequate funding for elections. And finally, on the political side, I think a recognized important contribution to that election process was the appointment of Professor Jega as chairman of the INEC. Professor Jega is a well-respected academic and civil society activist and has a strong reputation for being a fair stakeholder. And so while there have been specific challenges and opportunities that the INEC has faced in advance of the 2015 elections, we need to look at such issues as funding, politicization, and maintaining dialogue with political parties. But focusing on the positive here, I'll describe some work and some inputs into the INEC with civil society to ensure, as I mentioned earlier, that there has been consensus building around this process. And while many challenges remain, there are three examples I did want to highlight. The first was a stakeholders forum that was conducted in January in Abuja with our colleagues from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And this brought together representatives from the executive, legislative branch, the judiciary, political parties, government officials, and civil society to reach consensus on 11 key recommendations for the process moving forward. They came forth with a communique that was presented to the president, that was presented to the judiciary and the legislative branch. And some highlights of those recommendations included, for example, the timeliness of the adjudication of electoral offenses, parties' commitment to internal party democracy, clarification of campaign finance rules, and then working with electoral management bodies and political parties to take measurable steps to improve access for persons with disabilities throughout the entire election process. And so that's a second project that I wanted to describe, and that is our work with persons with disabilities. And as a very concrete example, how advocacy efforts from the civil society community have impacted the INEC in Nigeria to make substantive changes to the process. So for example, IRI worked with INEC in developing their frequently asked questions regarding persons with disabilities, and we assisted them in developing a sign language video to assist hearing impaired individuals in their outreach and communications with the Commission. Subsequently, INEC has set up a disabilities desk to help coordinate activities for persons with disabilities throughout the entire election process. And we've also been working with the Nigerian National Association of the Deaf, developing a manifesto to engage INEC and political parties and government officials to implement policies that are going to provide access and inclusion to the deaf community during the elections. And so we were pleased to see that last week the National Association of the Deaf in Nigeria launched a Deaf Manifesto, and it's a document of proposals developed by something called the Deaf Political Action Committee, and it's an advocacy tool for expanding the inclusion of deaf persons in the political process at both the gubernatorial level, where Nigeria is having many elections, and the subnational level. And this association also developed a social contract to work directly with governors and political parties in Nigeria. But most germane to our discussion here today, INEC has been very closely involved with IRI's work and has participated in the launch of the Deaf Manifesto and has agreed to take hold of the social contract as well. Independently, INEC has been working with civil society to develop tools to include all of persons with disabilities, and they're now working on changing and providing capacity to print Braille language, tabulation, and voter cards, which is a very important step forward for the ballot process. Secondly, along with contributing directly from the civil society angle, the third area I wanted to touch on is the role of public opinion polling and how that can shape the external influence on an election commission. And I just wanted to highlight for you some survey research we did around the 2000 elections. We're not doing it for the forthcoming elections, but we were able to do some pre- and post-election polling around the 2000 elections that showed a real positive change of Nigerians' confidence that their vote in the general election in 2011 was fairly counted, kept secret, and properly collated, and that corruption had been reduced within the INEC. And so we had some statistics, for example, of 63% with confidence in the INEC and before the election, and afterward, 52% had even said that the conduct of elections had improved. And so I point that out as another input from external audiences onto the work of election commissions, specifically for Nigeria. A second country example I wanted to briefly talk about also was in Mali, and where Mali has rather complicated set of electoral management bodies. They actually have 3 electoral management bodies that are in charge of the process. For example, the General Delegation for Elections, the DGE, is responsible for things such as the creation of voter lists, printing identity cards, et cetera. And then the Ministry of Territorial Administration is responsible for a separate process, and that's the actual printing of election materials and the general administration of the process, while the Election Commission in Mali is really charged with just the oversight of election day activities. And so that's an example of where the situation is a bit different from Zambia. But what we found really was that there was a real absence of the proper coverage of this process in Mali. And so we attempted to work with journalists and to provide them with training on reporting and coverage of the political process, the roles and responsibilities of each of the electoral management bodies in Mali, so that they could best address this as they presented the news to the citizens of Mali. And it was a fascinating process, the first time journalists had really ever taken a step back to think about their responsibility in the proper coverage of how these bodies are performing within the process, within the electoral process. And finally, a third example to mention is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, there's a lot going on with elections in Congo and in the DRC. And I really just wanted to highlight a few inputs that are really noteworthy for DRC. And I think one example that really strikes me is the role of the National Assembly in the DRC. And we now have, it was announced last year, the electoral process for the next 3 years. We're a year behind, almost 2 years behind now. But what you can see really is I think a very significant delay on the part of the National Assembly, and there are many reasons for this, but it's just simply to highlight that while election commissions have a very significant and important role to perform and can be perfectly up to speed without the corresponding and complementary electoral laws, things can come to a dramatic halt. And so while the National Assembly, for example, in Kinshasa would have to pass laws impacting local elections in that country, their current legislative calendar is probably not going to provide time to do so for those local elections to happen anytime soon. Alarmingly, there is allegedly a clause also at the bottom of the legislative calendar that discusses constitutional change of term limits. And I think Burkina Faso was referenced or will be discussed. And we know that that's obviously going to be a very impactful question to be addressed in the DRC. Additionally, some say a census is needed before elections would take hold in the DRC. They've just appointed a director of the census process. But speculation is that a census could take up to 4 years. And so even if the electoral process moves forward, what does that mean in terms of the census? And finally is funding. The Central Election Commission in DRC has only received so far 30% of its budget. And so, of course, things have slowed down significantly. And so with those three examples, civil society, political stakeholders, public opinion polling in Nigeria, journalist coverage of the electoral process in Mali, and perhaps and hopefully the need for complementary legislative action in the DRC, we can see some of the need to look at a more holistic process on the electoral process. I hope that illuminates some of these factors for you, both positive and negative, that can impact the work of election commissions and the many variables that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. Really appreciate that. My good friend Keith,
Thank you, good
round it
doctor.
out for us.
Well, I would like to, first of all, thank all of you for being here and to thank you all, the Wilson Center for the invitation, my colleague Gretchen. There are some bipartisan panels that still function in Washington. And to Dr. Isaac, I'm very happy that you're here, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit about the upcoming presidential by-election. Let me just say that Dr. Famunyo was going to be here, and since he couldn't be here, I'll just mention Burkina Faso very quickly. Most of you who follow African politics know that the long-serving President Blaise Compaoré, I saw you coming my way, made a quick exit on a French plane a few days ago, October 31st. And this is after there had been mounting demonstrations taking place in Ouagadougou. He was attempting to extend his length of service by manipulating the Constitution. But the people of Burkina Faso thought otherwise. And that's still unfolding, and unlike the hope that Gretchen expressed in the DRC's National Assembly, the National Assembly and Burkina didn't have the opportunity to play a role because the Constitution was suspended. And there's concern now about Zida, who has taken over, and whether there was a palace coup or this is a continuation, in fact, of Compaoré's service, because Zida was the number 2 in the presidential guard, and that was the only body keeping Blaise Compaoré in power. I'll just mention when we think about some of the countries that we call critical elections, it's because of what has happened in the past. And perhaps one thing to do is, just as a point of departure, I was tasked with talking about the future, but the future is actually happening now. The electoral process in 2014 that just took place in South Africa, you see the emergence of the economic freedom fighters, and they represent a new trend of young people, and some not so young, but a much more nationalistic approach to policy. The elections that just took place in Mozambique that are still being debated, whether Renamo and Dhlakama will become prime minister like Kenya or Zimbabwe, is still an open question. And if he doesn't, he could go back to the bush, and maybe we're looking again at another 16 years of civil war that cost 1 million lives. And so what we mean by critical is that. And even in Malawi, where the sitting president tried to annul the elections, and in Botswana, where the Constitutional Court is still deciding whether or not the president can appoint the speaker. Those things are happening right now. In 2015 and 2016, there are a lot of elections taking place. I want to focus in on a few that happen to be in Horn of Africa and Southern and East Africa, namely Ethiopia, Nigeria. I just pulled Nigeria over. Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda. And I think it's important because when you think about Ethiopia, most people might have impressions of here on 9th Street, the Ethiopian restaurants, etc. But Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa. And this will be the first election since the passing of the former, the late Prime Minister Meles, who is credited with the economic rebound that is taking place in that country. At the same time, 2015, these elections may not bring about much change. Currently, out of the 547 members of parliament, there's only one opposition MP. The opposition is still fragmented, although they've formed a coalition to compete, and many of them argue that there's not a level playing field. And that's on the basis of the introduction of laws since 2005 that limit the political space, the media law, the anti-terror law, and the NGO law that says that no NGO can get more than 10% of its funding from foreign donors. The EPRDF has faced that type of criticism, but it's seen as a bedrock of stability in a region, quite frankly, that has known nothing but turmoil. And so it's natural that the Ethiopian government has to look at some very critical issues, such as conflict, in development, mitigating the impact of climate change, tackling migration issues. So these issues are very, very important. And one thing that you'll hear throughout this, the next few minutes that I have, is a recurring issue of context. We can't walk away from the fact that the technical exercise that directors like Dr. Isaac here take place within a political environment. I'll turn now to Nigeria because until the passing of President Sada, it was going to be the first election of 2015. And now it's going to be the third election because in Lesotho, after an alleged attempted coup, they will be holding elections in the middle of January. I'm not sure when. I'm hoping that, I don't know if you can tell us, but I'm hoping that you'll reveal when the elections may be in Zambia. But in Nigeria, after phenomenal progress in the 2011 elections under the leadership of Jagan, now what is emerging is a number of issues that probably would suggest that the February elections will not be without major problems in Nigeria. Some of this is so well known now. The insecurity that has been there and brought about by the group of Boko Haram. Still 219 of the 276 girls that are missing are still missing. And the current president, Goodluck Jonathan, while he's received, I think deservedly so, kudos for dealing with Ebola. Many of his opponents say that he's done little or nothing on the Boko Haram issue. And that nowadays this manipulation of religious and geographical concerns. Part of that relates to something that just happened this week. INEC, the Independent National Election Commission, decided that it would suspend efforts to create 30,000 additional polling units after this sparked controversy in the geopolitical zone in the southern part of the country. When this was discovered, when it was discovered that 21,000 would be going to the north, this has meaning in Nigeria because of what is happening in the northeast of the country. If you can't hold elections in the northeast, then there's a question, it's not an NDI term, but can free and fair elections be held in Nigeria? And what would an election in Nigeria mean if you didn't hold, or could not hold, rather, elections there? But by not adding those polling units, and whatever the political issue behind it, what it means basically is that hundreds of thousands of people will be disenfranchised. And that is what's currently happening in the country right now. And I'll be quick about the last two. In Sudan, it's currently facing, the current government is facing crisis of confidence. There's a conflict in 7 of the 17 states. And while the sitting president, Bashir, has announced that he is running again, that doesn't create a lot of confidence for the opposition or for civil society, because there's a national dialogue process that the NCP also initiated. And the opposition is saying, well, how can we engage in a very serious national dialogue process if you're moving forward with the elections? While the government is saying, well, we have to move forward with the elections because we can't have a political vacuum in the country. The AU's high panel led by Thabo Mbeki is trying to sort this out. But suffice it to say that the current federal government continues to undermine democratic and accountable governance through the marginalization of the peripheries, inequitable allocation of resources to states, high levels of military expenditure, some that are not on the books, as well as corruption. And now it has to manage an economic crisis partly developed as a result of South Sudan becoming independent. In Tanzania, again, it's at a crossroads in one of the most dynamic periods in its history. A rather radical constitutional review process was underway that called for 3 entities that included an independent Zanzibar. And the process was stymied for a while, and it looked as if the government and the ruling party had struck a deal with the opposition that they would come back to the Constituent Assembly following the 2015 elections. But overnight, the Constitution was passed. And that has created a certain kind of environment, as well as some concerns about corruption within the government. And this process now means that there will be a referendum. And Director Isaac can tell you that at elections time, it is supposed to be the Election Commission that speaks. Well, in the Tanzania case, the Attorney General has given a date for the referendum, and the President has given a date for the referendum. And maybe it would be okay if they gave the same date, but they're different dates. But it's a very serious issue. Although there was a government of national unity that came into being with the reform of the Constitution in 2010, there have been some incidents of violence on Zanzibar, and even on the mainland. And there's some religious overtones. And if any of you know the geography coming down the coast from Kenya, it could be a real problem. An independent Zanzibar also might create some concerns for certain governments outside of Tanzania, given historical linkages. So there is a potential for violence, although Tanzania doesn't have that history. I'll skip over Uganda and maybe take it up in questions, but just in honor of Director Isaac, I can't help, since I lived in Zambia for 2 years, to mention Zambia. As most of you know, Zambia's president, Michael Sata, passed away on October 28th. And his ruling party, the Patriotic Front, had come into power after trying 3 times unsuccessfully and going to court. Since 2011, there's been a lot of accusations thrown back and forth about the character of government. But whatever the situation is, Sata's vice president, Guy Scott, is ascended to the presidency, but because of some quirks in the Constitution, the current Constitution, he actually cannot be president, run and win. He happens to be white or of European descent, Scottish, I believe. And this has given some degree of concern to certain quarters within the population. But there's also accusations of ethnic divisions within the ruling party, maybe more than 15 people who would aspire to be the president. And then in the opposition, it's fragmented and divided. And there's rumors that the former president, Rupiah Banda, will run again. Whatever happens in January, I think it has to take place before the January 27th. It will just be a forerunner to the planned 2016 elections that will take place in September or October, or at some point once it's called. And there have been a lot of violence during the by-elections. The last one, there wasn't violence. And let me just, because I was challenged earlier to give some lessons learned. And I think these would be some of the main lessons that we as NDI would put forth. Just first, it's important to understand that elections have three main functions. And that's to resolve peacefully competition for political power. It is also a way of citizens determining who should have the authority to govern them. And third, it's a way for electors to choose the policies that they believe best would represent their interests. And if that's the case, then these would be things that we think any reasonable person should look for. Integrity in the leadership of the electoral management body. Because if the body that is supposed to oversee the process is corrupt, then there's no way you could expect that body to produce something that, it's like an anti-corruption commission being corrupt. I think that's the best way to understand it. When elections fail, particularly where there's widespread violence and national trauma, extraordinary efforts at dialogue across political divides are needed, as well as stock-taking and reconciliation efforts. And so if that doesn't happen and you go back to elections in Cote d'Ivoire, perhaps you'll repeat the same thing that happened in the last election. Mounting peaceful elections with integrity is a complex challenge that stretches across numerous institutions and processes and requires engagement from all sections of the community, just as Gretchen Berkel was saying. The quality of an electoral process typically reflects the democratic character of governance leading to an election and can be an important indicator of the nature of the governance that might come as a result of the election. Systematic observation of election processes by nonpartisan citizen observers who work in a constructive way with election management bodies can make vital contributions to the process. Assistance by the international community to support democratic processes and electoral processes should be robust and proactive, but it should be done on the basis of respect for the sovereignty of the host country. Finally, I would say that to be credible, elections must be inclusive, transparent, and encompass accountability. An accurate reading of any electoral process means that you have to look at the entire process, not just election day. And that means you have to take into account all aspects, voter education, voter registration in particular, the campaign period, the candidate selection process, all of the things that my good friend Almami Sila knows from having been an election management body chair. But ultimately, it is the people of a country who determine the credibility of their elections and of the country's democratic development. Additionally, while elections are a key ingredient of democracy, it should be understood that they are not synonymous with democracy. And finally, elections and political processes are processes, not single events. Just as democracy is much more than elections, genuine elections are a requisite for democracy. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers. I think we've heard a lot about just the operational, on-the-ground experience of actually managing a commission, an electoral commission, and the process that it oversees. We've heard a lot about the key role that international and domestic partners can play, as well as the ingredients that go into making elections successful. We've also talked a lot about the context in which some of these electoral commissions and elections take place. Let me now open up the floor to Q&A, and I'd ask, we have a very short window. I'd ask that you please just introduce yourself very quickly and your affiliation, and then ask your question 30 seconds or less. I'll take 3 at a time. Identify the speaker to whom you're addressing the question, and then we'll let the speakers go for it. So floor is open. I see a gentleman back there. I see this gentleman here, and I see the gentleman there. So over to you, sir.
My name is Arthur Gwagwa. I am Zimbabwean, so neighbors to Zambia. My question, I wanted to direct it to Priscilla, but I think I'm going to direct it to Ms. Becker, is it right?
Yes.
There were accusations that there's an Israeli company called Nikov, which was involved in rigging the Zimbabwean elections, and that it is currently based within the Zimbabwean Defense Forces headquarters. And there were rumors that it was operating in several other African countries like Zambia. To what extent is that true? And what can we do as civil society to work against maybe the interests or to find out more about what is happening? Because in my view, that is an external influence on their electoral integrity. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the gentleman over here. Sir?
Good afternoon. My name is Caleb Rossiter, American University and the American Exceptionalist Project. One question for Ms. Thank you. A question for Ms. Isaac and for Dr. Jennings. I can't let you come to our country and observe our bizarre hodgepodge of county elections that composite themselves into a federal result to ask some of your impressions of the elections that you saw recently. And for Dr. Jennings, having had the pleasure of being in both Sudan and Uganda earlier this year, one mortal enemy of the United States, where we have a full embargo, and one a pretty favored government of the United States. I was disappointed to find in both sort of an underlying tension in which civil society or people's ability to run for office is very hamstrung by almost a secret police type of effort, where people who try to form parties in both countries magically find their spouses thrown out of work or their children not going to university, the sort of effective way that sort of the Soviet states used to run, keeping people out of elections without saying there's no election. Give us a little bit about Uganda, please, because that's such an interesting case, and we're wondering if the current president is going to try to run yet again.
Okay, I think there's a gentleman here. Sir? Oh, he's over here, sorry, with glasses. Right there, sorry.
Thank you very much. Well, my name is Anthony Chanka, and I am from Zambia. So, Director Priscilla Isaac, first of all, I want to commend you for the great work that you've done in Zambia with the elections. However, I have a couple concerns that I just wanted to see if you can address. Basically, first and foremost is on the inclusion of everybody to participate in the elections, and that really includes the Zambians in the diaspora, which we've seen really being marginalized, with either no efforts by either the government or any other institutions to try and engage these communities. I'm part of a nonprofit organization that my friends and I co-founded, which is the International Institute of Zambian Progress. And part of what we want to do is to really engage the Zambian folks in the diaspora to get involved in Zambia. So if you can please discuss anything that you're going to do to make sure that the Zambian folks are included. We've seen many countries do absentee ballots. As a Zambian living in the States, I cannot vote and participate in that. So if you can elaborate on that a little bit. And then the second question I wanted to ask is on the electoral code of conduct, really for the political parties, which we've seen, I think, Zambia generally is a peaceful country, but for the past 3 years, based on the reports and being on the ground, what we've seen with the PF government, it's like we've been going backwards a little bit as far as the conduct with these political parties. So what is your commission really doing to make sure that these political parties can actually adhere to the laws? We actually seeing it right now with people trying to fight for the who's going to run for the PF presidency there. Any policies that you're going to put in place to make sure that there's, we've seen in advanced countries where there's primary elections, absolutely. I'll make it shorter, just a few more seconds. What can you do?
Counting you down, let's go.
Absolutely, thank you. So what can you do in the future to make sure that these political parties adhere to the electoral code of conduct?
So, several questions. We've talked about some of the positive role that international partners can play in elections. Our colleague from Zimbabwe raises a potential negative role that international partners could play and what to do about that. Observations on the U.S., recent U.S. elections, concern about the closing or narrowing political space for civil society participation in several countries. Uganda and Sudan were referenced in particular. Inclusion of the diaspora in elections, and then the electoral code of conduct and misbehavior by political parties. What are you going to do about that? Priscilla, you want to start and then we just roll it down?
All right. Nikov did assist us with the management of our voter registration some years back. I think my colleagues may recall the yellow card. My Zambian colleagues may recall the yellow card that we previously had. Yes, it is an Israeli company, but we discontinued with them in 2000 when we did a completely fresh registration. We engaged another company to assist us with the software and the hardware. In terms of Zimbabwe, I can't comment much as to how they're operating there. But what I would say is that the way forward, I think, is to be able to sit down, all stakeholders to be able to sit down with ZEC to discuss your concerns and to know exactly what is going on. I think the lesson we learned from Zambia in terms of voter registration, and in fact with all the technology that we have adopted, including the results management transmission, is to take ownership of it yourselves, manage it, have the capacity to manage it. And this is where we're at, as at now, with Zambia. Even the company that we took on after Nikuv, we had some issues with them in terms of the contract, in terms of the rights to the software. I've forgotten what the IT technical thing that you call it. But which means that you cannot do anything with the software. You cannot improve the software. You cannot make any changes to it. You cannot enhance it any further without the permission of the initiators. And where we're at now with the enhancement of our register, since we went biometric, we ensured that within the contract there was a clause of that we take full ownership, take full rights. And so because of this, we are able to now even make improvements to the system in-house. And we have a great team of young men whom I fear each day to lose. I really have to look after them because they have the knowledge. Right now we're receiving assistance from USAID to the tune of $500,000 in terms of the development of the transmission of results from the polling station to the central. So for me, my advice is sit down with ZEC. You have a new chairperson. I've met her. She's a lovely person. And I'm sure you would be able to make headway in that regard. In terms of the impression of your elections, first of all, I'll say that you're very fortunate that you can afford to have the technology that you have. I wish we could afford that. In fact, we're looking at how we can pool resources within the SADC region in terms of the equipment for results transmission and so forth. So you have the technology, you have the facilities. You saw some of my voter registration centers, so you have it all to be able to, for voters to come and vote in comfort and so forth. They're within reach and so forth. But I think you need this issue of where each state has got different rules for running an election. I'm glad I don't work here and I don't have to run an election here. I think that's got to us. And also, I think it was mentioned also the amount of money that is spent, and I don't know. It's a bit frightening. We don't have strict financial regulations in Zambia, but I suppose we haven't reached the stage where we have that much money for people to throw around. Because like I said earlier on, the amounts that some candidates spent on election, I could run a general election with that. Unfortunately, we didn't get to mingle with the voters too much because, like I said, you have different rules. In one polling station, the presiding officer wouldn't let us come near the voters, and others were not too keen to talk to us. So really to get first-hand impression from actual voters, that's something I missed out on, though I think some of my group members mentioned something. And then in terms of voting in the diaspora, unfortunately, unless the law is changed as an electoral commission, we cannot do anything about it. I do recall when I was sitting back on the Electoral Reform Commission some time ago that we did recommend that Zambians in the diaspora should be allowed to vote. But unfortunately, I don't think the new draft constitution has actually made a provision for it. And that's rather disappointing because there was a lot of debate on it. So I think you need to connect with people back home before it moves forward. But I'll make a mention of it when I get back home. We also have issues in terms of the powers of the commission. I think you recall in my slide I mentioned that our powers are limited, and how do we deal with these erring political parties? Other electoral commissions have the powers to disqualify, to fine, and it works well. With us, we don't have those powers. All we can do is rap people on the knuckles. The strongest thing we have right now is to be able to postpone an election. And that had an enormous effect last year. I mean, everybody called us names, from the PF to UNIP, everybody. They just couldn't believe it that we had postponed an election. So as a commission, we really need more powers. But what we have done is to engage political parties more. Sit them around the table before and after an election. In fact, we had a not too good election in August where they misbehaved, and we called all the candidates and their campaign managers and gave them a telling off. So really, unless we're given more powers, and unfortunately the draft constitution is not providing for that, so that's something we also have to take up when I get back home.
Great, thank you. I think I was also asked to comment on the process in Zimbabwe, and I have to say I'm not familiar with NICUV in Zimbabwe, but I think as Director Isaac said, the important thing is, and my main point was sort of is consensus around the process. And so her point is very well said, that you need to really manage the process and make sure that it is transparent so that all of the stakeholders feel that it is a fair process moving forward. It's not uncommon to have, of course, international corporations or bodies who contribute technical supplies and equipment, and so it's sort of not out of the ordinary because papers have to come from someplace and ballot machines and voting machines come from someplace, but so it's not uncommon in that sense at all, but I'm not that familiar with it at all. I was not asked specifically about the diaspora, but I did want to mention that as I think what an interesting sort of advocacy campaign to start around Zimbabwe, and that's sort of my point, how civil society can really impact the role of an election and how there functions in commissions. And there are, of course, many, many examples from around the world where diaspora has been successful in including their vote. So.
Can I just, before I turn to Keith, just very quickly on that, and I'd love to talk to my brother from Zimbabwe. I think the problem in Zimbabwe is, I'm not a diplomat, so I'm going to shoot straight. The problem in Zimbabwe is much more than the Israeli company. It's local, it's domestic, that needs to be addressed by the Zimbabwean people first and foremost. And I think until Zimbabwe makes progress on that, all these other issues are just cosmetic and on top of, but not the real issue. And we can talk more about what I mean by that. I'm happy to have that discussion. The diaspora issue, big issue across the African continent. Some countries are doing better on it than it. But the real problem is not that for the Electoral Commission. The real problem is, to this day, many African governments see those in the diaspora as a threat rather than as a resource. Until you change that mentality around, there's nothing that the Electoral Commission can do about it. So I think the larger issue is, with more and more Africans leaving the continent, how do you get governments on the African continent to see these people as a resource, particularly in this globalized environment, that can contribute to the development at home rather than see them as a political risk? That's a different question that I don't think Priscilla can answer, but we're going to be having a debate on this because we will be doing at the Wilson Center an event on Africa's underutilized resource looking at the diaspora, and you're welcome to that. Keith.
I'm happy you drew a distinction between you're not being diplomatic. I'm trying to get a visa to Khartoum. Let me just say that.
You got work to do.
Let me just say that you have in the NCP a group of people who led a coup, and that has distorted some of the governance thinking. And it's not always clear whether or not the current government has control over the military. But whatever the case, I think it's an interesting comparison or contrasting that you draw between the NCP in Khartoum and the National Resistance Movement, or the MNR, in Kampala, because those two governments and those two leaders in particular don't see eye to eye on much. But I think that it's a general reality of closing space for civil society, especially with the tinkering with administrative laws, maybe not constitutional, that says, as they're doing now in Kenya, that if you get a certain percentage of your funding from, more than a certain percentage from foreign governments, you have to register as a foreign entity. And this is something that I think a number of African leaders have picked up from Putin. But the closing space is a general phenomenon, whether they pass laws or not. And so on one hand, you have a group of people who led a coup. On the other hand, in Uganda, you have people who saw themselves coming in as a national liberation movement. And others the civil society is not seen as a neutral group of people. They all often are seen as oppositional, and again, especially when you have weak opposition parties. So that's what I would say in a diplomatic way. Let me just end by saying the 2016 elections are the third multi-party elections and the fifth competitive, but Museveni, although no one's declared who's running, has made some recent moves, like having a cabinet reshuffle that resulted in one person being removed, the former prime minister, who was seen as potentially the main challenger, who still occupies the position of Secretary General of the party, but that probably will be taken care of at the next Congress that will take place early next year. But whatever the case, it's unlikely that Museveni, who would have been in power for 30 years, will be unseated in 2016. And there was some speculation that he might make way for his son, but with the new oil and gas funds, that doesn't appear to be the case. And I've been to Kampala a lot of times, so I'm not being as diplomatic there.
All right, let me take 3 more questions, and please keep them short because I just saw a number of hands go up. Let me just swing down this way. I'll get to you all. Let's start right here. Please keep them short so we can get everybody in.
Hello, my name is Steve Weissman. The question was raised about this census in DRC, in the Congo, that may be used as a pretext to delay election. Wondering, in Zambia, what has been the relevance of the census to your work? Do you need a recent census to have an adequate voter roll and voter registration, or can it be done without such a census?
That's a good question. The lady right behind her, right there.
Hi, Abigail, I'm an independent consultant. I had a question Madam Isaac about, it seems you've had a lot of success with your commission, especially on two things, independence of the commission and also election technology. A lot of other African countries have struggled with both of those issues, both being independent from the government and also kind of being independent from the vendors that are marketing election technology. So I want to know what the secret is. How have you had success in both of those areas?
There's a gentleman right there.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Alfred, and I'm from Uganda. I would like to make a comment to Priscilla and to congratulate you for running a very successful commission. We are proud of you. I'd like to ask a question whether you're considering the representation, more representation for women in Zambia, because in Uganda we had the same position and women were badly represented, but through the constitutional process, Uganda today has 30% of women in parliament. And we also have interest groups in parliament, including disabilities, people with disabilities, workers, the youth, the armed forces because of our history, and also we are considering the diaspora. For us, the diaspora is not a threat, it's an asset for us. Secondly, I had some comment about the dispensation, political dispensation in Uganda. I'd like to make a few comments, just one. Since 2001, Uganda has had a multi-party dispensation after a referendum, and that, of course, democracy is not a perfect process, and Uganda cannot claim to be one, but I think we should desist from making judgments and rather encourage countries that in spite of whatever they are witnessing as challenges in building democracies, we should encourage them rather than make judgments. Thank you.
The gentleman right next to him. Thank you.
Carl Levan from American University. And I just wanted to follow up on the Burkina Faso comments as well. Yesterday, our students organized an extraordinary conference call with activists in Burkina Faso, and today the military junta is considering the civil society's transition plan, which excitingly is in line with some of the international demands and pressure, including the U.S. demand request that the transitional government be a civilian government and be in place very soon. But we're also seeing there echoes of Egypt around April or May 2011, where activists seem to be so happy that Compaoré is gone that they've forgotten that the military is actually in control. My question is a fairly narrow one, and it has to do with what have we learned about registration when it comes to continuous registration versus a finite time schedule. Nigeria has been really wedded to, for example, very short periods of voter registration. So in this summer, you saw voter registration rates of 90 or 95% in local government areas that happen to be very supportive of the president, and 30 or 35% registration rates in other parts of the country. And all fingers point to very low voter turnout, and also inexplicably high turnout in some areas.
Thank you. Was there another hand? Okay, sir, just 30 seconds, right here, and then yes, please. Then I'll turn it over.
Thank you, David Benowitz. A couple of people in the panel made the very good point that elections, even free and honest elections, are not the same as democracy. And I'm just wondering, how do you promote democracy? Who should be doing it? Should it be part of the Electoral Commission charter, perhaps through expansion of voter education?
Okay, so some really good questions there. One about the relevance of the census and elections. Two, some of the successes that Zambia has seen, particularly with the independence of the commission and other areas. Number three, and this I agree with my brother from Uganda, I think there's some countries that are doing really well in terms of women's representation, and Uganda's model is actually one of the ones that I think is an interesting study. Although I still have my questions about, is it the 10 seats that are reserved for the military within Parliament? But we can talk about that. We can talk about that. But having said that, no, this is really, I mean, Africa in many ways, there's 6 African countries in the top 10 of women's representation in Parliament. I think this is a good success story that is often not told about Africa. What is striking to me is that of those countries, they're mostly countries that have been through conflict. And what I say is that it really should not take your going through conflict to do the right thing. So that's a side observation, but I will turn it over to the speakers here. The political dispensation in Uganda, absolutely understood. This is a forum. We know we're making progress, but there's need to do better. And so I think we all agree. We're just saying it differently. You're being more of a diplomat. I'm being more of the academic. And that's fine, but I think we're all saying the same thing. Uganda has made progress, but there's certainly room for improvement. I think even you would agree with that. I think that's the key point we're trying to make. And then Carl's point about the military coup of people power in Burkina Faso and the voter registration issue, I think that was a really important one. And then who's responsible for promoting democracy. So I'll ask you to pick on 2 of those, because we don't have time. Just pick 2 of the questions and that you would like to comment on, and then we'll go. Keith, I'll ask you to bring us in this time.
Sure, I'll pick on the question of promoting democracy and who. I think for all of us who happen to be Americans, November 4th ought to give everyone pause, and we could go back to other things, like 2000, or in some cases, we can go back hundreds of years. So I think that connecting that to the question of being judgmental, I think that if we see ourselves as citizens of the world, we have a responsibility to say that this is what you have said you want to see, not anything that someone is trying to impose. But I do think context matters, and that's no small thing that should be tossed aside. And so the character of government. In Ethiopia, the government sees itself as I guess it still sees itself as a socialist government. The federal constitution that it put together had Marxist orientation, and they therefore have a different ideological outlook about development. And so trying to understand that is very important. And so when we ask what might be the outcome of the election, it's all prognosis. No one sits here with a crystal ball. Even though in the case of Uganda, one of the things that President Museveni said prior to becoming president is that the problem in Africa was that leaders stayed too long. And so I think that we have to be honest with our assessments, but we also have to be respectful of the sovereignty of a country, because at the end of the day, it's the people, as I said earlier, who will determine the credibility, not those of us who sit 8,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.
Okay, maybe just to comment a bit on Burkina. It's such a fascinating time, and I would love to hear what your students found out from the civil society representatives there. You know, it really shows some governments are going too far with this concept of extending their term limits, and that's why I raised it with the possibility in DRC as well. And just to touch on that again, there is allegedly on the legislative calendar in Kinshasa consideration of constitutional term limits. And there are, I hear, some small protests now starting up in Kinshasa. And what happened in Burkina is, you know, the model that you don't really want to happen. They reached a tipping point and they went over it. And instead of just waiting for elections to happen, which to me is sort of a tragic step that it really got to this. And it really undermined what could have been a smooth process, but it's a very important lesson for many countries in the region. And so, you know, great for civil society to take control of some of this process. I don't know much about their transition plan, and so actually that would be something very beneficial for all of us to learn more about as well. For registration, I was I'm curious to watch the rolling process that they had in Nigeria, because I thought initially that sounded that this could be a smooth way to do it. But my understanding is that security concerns and other issues delayed some of the processes. They came in batches. I know you're very familiar with this. And so it was disappointing that it didn't go as smoothly as possible, because to undertake it all at once can be totally consuming for a country and can, just take up all of the bandwidth of momentum around elections. It's a huge undertaking in many of these countries' registration processes. So it was unfortunate that it played out that way in Nigeria. I'm going to do two, because I'll just tap into what Keith was saying about democracy and to that answer. And it really is so much more of a process, obviously, beyond elections. And it's, it's many things. What is democracy? It's media, it's open media, it's freedom of speech and civil participation and activism like you're seeing in Burkina Faso right now with youth. It's the voting process. It's all of these things together. And so the promotion of democracy is very difficult to define, I would say.
Sure. And Priscilla, since you're a special guest, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to close us off.
Okay, very, very quickly. Census, yes, it's very important before we undertake voter registration. The practice in Zambia has been to conduct a census every 10 years. And we last had a census in 2010. It's very cardinal because it gives us an idea as a commission who are the first-time voters to target and the population spread, et cetera, so it is important. We will not be conducting a census before the 2016, I doubt. We just did one in 2010, but we'll still get estimates from the Central Statistics Office to guide us, yeah. The independence of the commission and how have we managed. I think as a commission we believe, and my chairperson, who is Justice Irene Mambilima, and incidentally she's also our Deputy Chief Justice, has always reminded us that you only be as independent as you allow yourself to be, because you can have it in black and white, but if you don't make use of what is in black and white, then you can be made to run around in circles, not just by the ruling party, but everybody and anybody you deal with, suppliers, opposition, and so forth. And as a commission, we have taken a very strong stand. We are lucky that we have a very strong chairperson, and I believe that each one of us has made it a point that we do not want to exit the commission in shame. And that means standing up for what you believe. It means having to be courageous. It means having to be able to say no, even to the president, which I have had to do. And may his soul rest in peace. I'm going to miss him, because he was very supportive. I mean, there were times he would pick up the phone and bark at me, and I would say, but no, Your Excellency, you can't do that. But, life goes on. So it's about you as an individual. And if you're lucky enough to work with people who have your same principles and you're willing to pull together, then that helps a lot. We haven't had it easy, but that's it. Then in terms of women representation in Zambia, like I mentioned earlier on, it's a constitutional issue. Even for the other special groups, it's a constitutional issue. I haven't seen anything in the draft constitution which will provide for this. The only thing I've seen is electing MPs from a provision for 100 elected MPs from party lists. The other earlier proposals were that we should have quota for women, the youth, and the disabled groups, but I don't recall seeing it in this draft. So I think those were the ones that were directed to me. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much. And to that, Priscilla, I would add that leadership and commitment matter, because I know you've been through periods where it has been particularly stressful and you have stayed with it. It's also standing up to the insults, which invariably do come when people are unhappy with what you're doing. So we thank you for what you're doing in that area. And with that, I want to thank all of you for coming to this session. Please join me in thanking our three speakers that I thought did a wonderful job. And to the wonderful Africa program team, thank you very much, and you're welcome to continue discussions. Thank you. Thank you. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you.
I was thinking we match.
You know, I was also
It's funny because I was like, I'm gonna wear my blue one.
That would have been so funny.